Hey everyone, thank you for being here and welcome to Digital Moralia, a regular talk show on digital life or contemporary living. The title is based on Adorno's Minima Moralia, that's Minima Moralia of 1951, a book subtitled Reflections on Damaged Life. It was a book of fragments, so short, polemical text which reflected on basically late capitalist living, whereas this is subtitled Reflections on Digital Life, with the proviso that digital life is anyhow largely damaged. So we'll hopefully come up with some suggestions as to how we can fix that damage over the coming episodes. This first episode, I'm really happy to have with us Ernesto Vargas, Emma Stamm, and Adam Turl. So before I read the bios, we're just going to respond to the meme here, the "What vibe do I give off" meme. So you might have seen these memes before. Basically, you need to choose, some of these objects to give us an idea of what vibe. Maybe we have to do it for each other. Even would be easier, but maybe that's kind of unfair. No, we're not going to do it for each other. I don't know you well enough. All right, let's do it for yourselves. Okay, so like I would go like off the top of my head, 1D and the and sign. So that's the capitalist realism, the can of tenants, even though I don't drink super tenants, and that you can't really see here. Maybe if you're looking at this like really small, it's acupuncture. This woman has needles in her head. So the others are all variations of marijuana, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's me, 1D and the and sign. You want to go next, Adam?
Well, probably the number 2, C, and the ampersand, or not? Yeah, the at sign.
The at sign, which is like some weed, basically. Yeah. Just for anyone who can't see really closely, at the top you have, obviously you can see a capitalist realism jumper. Then you have a Ghost of My Life face mask, and Weird and the Eerie. It's a Weird and the Eerie book cover on some like basically Bermuda shorts or swimming shorts. Then it's actually, you really can't see this if you have it really small on your screen. Number 4 is a bikini with the K-punk book cover, the compendium of Fisher writings, and then number 5 is the post-capitalist desire cover on a sock. Okay, and then the rest of the pictures I think you can basically make out. So Emma, do you want to have a go?
Sure. So I'm gonna go with the K-punk anthology string bikini.
Okay.
I'll also go with the coffee, the Starbucks C, and I mean, in terms of vibe I give off, I think probably people think I'm stoned sometimes, so I'll go with the at symbol.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Ernesto.
Okay. I'm gonna go with 1 with the jumper. With C, of course, the coffee. I'm not much of an energy drink guy, and the hashtag, right? That's magic brownies. I'm guessing.
Yeah, or hash cakes, as we say. I think.
Right.
I didn't do that on purpose, though. But yeah, the hash cakes have a hashtag. So now we're all introduced, right? So we're basically here to discuss on this first episode the legacy of Mark Fisher. So it's a bit of a wide topic and a large undertaking, but it follows me writing an article which was published in the Sublation magazine, called "The Legacy of Mark Fisher in the Meme Era." And basically, I point to the main thing we can take from him being his desire to push social class awareness, okay, and to create a social, or particularly a social class identity among the working class. So, I mean, that's the main thing to take away from that, although I do kind of get there talking a little bit about Russell Brand and the kind of trouble that Fisher got into for supporting Russell Brand a few years ago. But without getting into that in depth yet, the kind of conclusion is that Fisher was really aiming at a raising of social awareness via what he called acid communism, which would be a kind of a return to to the kind of underground movements of the 60s and 70s, and the ways in which they kind of fostered an awareness of class, or at least gave people an outlet at that time. So I want to go into that, but just basically into his three main works and his unfinished work, Acid Communism. So basically, look, I think it's obvious that we would start with capitalist realism. And this idea that capitalism discusses that there is no alternative. Okay, and actually what it says is that Thatcher said there is no alternative to capitalism, and Fisher is saying, you know, well, is there? But then he goes into the way in which capitalism co-opts anti-capitalist culture or left culture, so that kind of heads off any possibility of creating an alternative. And then he talks also about the way that capitalism causes and exacerbates mental illness, particularly depression. And he goes into what he calls a depressive hedonia, so this way in which people are seeking a hedonistic lifestyle, but one that ultimately also depresses. And he sees this a lot in the students he was teaching when he was writing the book there in the 2000s, in the first decade of the 2000s. So I want to also think about the cryptic ending of capitalist realism when he says in the last 2 pages, and just to read here, we must convert widespread mental health problems from medicalized conditions into effective antagonisms. Affective disorders are forms of captured discontent. This disaffection can and must be channeled outwards, directed towards its real cause, capital. So he basically suggests that we ought to be taking our kind of our ailments, our mental illnesses, and turning them around against capitalism, which I think he can only mean in a creative sense. So I think that is where the Acid Communist Project kind of comes in, and he clarifies that a lot more in the introduction to the unfinished book a bit later. So firstly, any thoughts on that and where we are with that? And I think a lot happened since then. So we're really talking about where are we with that post-COVID, because I think COVID kind of exacerbated some of these issues, i.e. capitalism leading to mental illness. And I suppose it sped up digital capitalism. And then I think at the end of, you know, a lot of us thought that at the end of COVID, there would become this moment when we all suddenly went outside again. And that would have been the time to have this acid communist movement. But actually, we didn't quite do that. And I think that's interesting, that maybe the moment was in some senses perfect, but then didn't ever materialize. So does anyone have any thoughts on those first kind of scattered reflections?
Yeah, I have a question. Oh, Emma, go ahead.
Well, why don't you say your question first? Sure. I've got my notes written down.
Okay, it's just a miscellaneous point about the article. At some point in the article, Mike, you mentioned that Mark Fisher, he captured the spirit or the event of the World Cup 2010. Can you elaborate on that? Can you tell us more about what happened there?
I don't know.
Is Mike on? Yeah. Okay.
I'm listening in. So I think what I was saying there, this was in the article on sublation, is that Fisher, I can actually find, but basically was that Fisher had these moments of intense enthusiasm for popular culture and for things that seem kind of random. And I think, you know, some of these things he pursued, like his deep admiration for Russell Brand, I won't say they were mistaken, but, you know, people say, there's a saying like, is that the hill you want to die on? As in, you know, do you really want to put everything into that? And Russell Brand's controversial, partly because he's made a number of comments that people say are sexist. Okay. I don't want to get into this too much in terms of, you know, whether Russell Brand is right or wrong, or, you know, whether he's good or bad. But just that, you know, Fisher had this tendency to, I mean, he was kind of a fanboy, and he would pursue these things with intense passion. And sometimes you find it slightly comical, you know, that he was putting so much into Brand. Brand basically appeared on the news there in. I don't actually now, embarrassingly, I don't remember the date. It's written here somewhere. 2000, I'm just going to hazard a guess and say around 2013, Brand appeared on Newsnight, the BBC Two. So basically, like one of the main news programs of British TV on the national channel there. He appeared on Newsnight, and he had just edited. Now this is again where I'm going to embarrass myself. Hang on, but I did actually write it here somewhere. He had edited a major British, the New Statesman. Sorry, he edited an edition of the New Statesman, and he actually based the whole edition around the idea of revolution. So he was invited onto Newsnight and asked to talk about revolution, and he basically did this whole kind of thing. I mean, Brand's a comedian, and he did this whole thing where he really wound up the very conservative behaving news anchor, saying, well, yeah, basically we do want a revolution. He was talking this very working class vernacular, as he does, being working class, but he has particularly working class kind of way of speaking. And the news anchor, Jeremy Paxton, was very kind of like dismissive of this in this very middle class way. And the next day there were a lot of reflections on this, and Fisher was right behind it. Like, we've had a working class person stand, get on TV, be interviewed, and basically, give the finger to this very middle class establishment figure, newsreader, news presenter. And, he was saying this is a great thing. At the same time, you had a lot of people saying, this is a really bad thing because Brand is effectively sexist, or in his comedian role, but also generally in his kind of role as a talking head. He said a number of distasteful things. And so, the debate came very much around that. And it sort of seems like a hangover from Gamergate, because a lot of this happened on Twitter. And so the debate got skewed, and it became about gender instead of about class. So, of course, the gender issues perhaps should be raised, but it's an example of how social class tends to get sidetracked by identity politics. So Fisher wrote about this in Exiting the Vampire Castle in 2013, and got like a lot more flack. So first he got a lot of flack, so by that I mean a lot of hassle online for supporting Brand. Then he wrote this text talking about how toxic the left are online, and he got in a lot more trouble with the identitarian left. So what I was basically saying is that Fisher had this tendency to, when he supported something, like really, really support it. And so this is kind of a very roundabout way of getting to your question on the World Cup. So what I basically say in the text here is he pursued these discoveries avidly with all the enthusiasm of a fanboy. This was an endearing quality, showing the human side of one of our greatest cultural critics, as he would, with childlike conviction, claim mainstream phenomena as his own, having seen the potential to mobilize people through them. Okay, so he would basically, he really looked like he was claiming Brand as his own. And the thing is, he'd seen Brand live the day before Brand went on BBC TV. I don't think he knew Brand personally. Maybe he did, but he had seen Brand live, and so was very excited about Brand generally. And so he suddenly became like Brand's biggest kind of fanboy. And the point is, there's another example when he got very excited by the World Cup in 2010. He made a blog, set up a blog around the World Cup, and he had a number of other theorists write for this blog, and it had kind of theoretical reflections, but it was more just like, I think part of it was that he wanted to get away a bit from just the theorizing, actually. So it was more like, people having fun around football. So that was just one example of how it seemed kind of unusual if you knew his work, maybe. But he had his tendencies to go off on these tangents suddenly. So because you were asking, Ernesto.
Yeah. But my question is, so you mentioned the example of the World Cup, right?
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on what happened then?
Well, that was just it. That he set up this blog around the World Cup.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
So I had some thoughts about your question regarding the transformation of mental health problems into sort of potent political energy, and what that has to do with acid communism and our contemporary sort of post-COVID moment. there's a lot going on there. But the first thing that I thought is that people who are struggling with mental illness, especially the kind that Fisher wrote about, especially depression specifically and related issues, they're very tired. I think there's a component of depression that is really about burnout and exhaustion, having to continuously exert oneself under advanced capitalism and instantiate oneself and compete and all of that without much of a break. So this idea that we must transform our condition, our mental condition, into not this individually experienced thing, but into a source of energy that can actually change things in the world. I think it can be interpreted as kind of like a mandate, like, you know, this is another task that you have to do above and beyond simply getting out of bed and, you know, paying your bills and doing whatever it takes to continue to survive in the 21st century, which, you know, for most people requires a huge amount of effort and, you know, some desperation even. And I think about Mark Fisher's idea that the future of politics might look like, or should look like, the unprecedented aestheticization of everyday life, where kind of like an artistic perspective to life is the center of our politics. And that is so far away, I think, from the way that most people think about politics, and also the way that we experience politics online. So throughout the pandemic, everybody was living their lives online. And our understanding of politics is very much as this kind of like non-aesthetic thing, essentially. Aesthetic meaning sort of sensual and manifest on the level of experience and kind of like the ineffable, rather than the way that we really engage politically now, which is through information. And if there are feelings involved, largely they are negative feelings, like anger a lot of the time, or sadness. So to go from that political experience of everyone being online and experiencing politics as like an onslaught of information and seeing things that piss you off and make you really sad, and that kind of contributing to this mass epidemic of mental health problems, I think it actually puts us, you know, we are not ideally poised right now, actually, for the acid communist moment, even though we're all kind of like coming out and back into the world, or at least some people are. I think that the pandemic actually really put us back in terms of that sort of aestheticization of life that helps us realize that we shouldn't just think about ourselves and be more invested in collectives and all of that, which is what Mark Fisher was all about. So, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of resistance on part of the people. So in the notes that we shared, I also wrote something about that that ending of capitalist realism. Same text we're talking about, and so something I've noticed is that people tend to identify in an alienated way with their conditions. Mm-hmm. Right. So for example, I have a friend who we've been talking about attention deficit disorder, right? Mm-hmm. And they can't entertain the notion that it could be socially mediated, right? Caused in any way by context, right? Mm-hmm. They find comfort, I would say, in the idea that it's something that could be diagnosed, separated, and cataloged, and treated in a way in which you purchase health. You know, so it's a very transactional kind of feeling. Like you go and all of these things that stop you from living your day-to-day life instead of kind of trying to see what about your daily life is adding to this sort of feedback loop. Instead of doing that, it's easier to just say, well, you have a deficiency in your brain of signaling and so on. And this is something that I guess I even talked with Doug about this back when we talked about Fisher a long time ago. And it's true. Of course, it's true that the brain, it has an issue, right? So, for example, depression, right? One type of depression can be that the serotonin in your brain is the intake, the re-intake. I'm sorry, of the serotonin in your brain is too speedy, right? So your brain releases serotonin and it takes it back too quickly, and it doesn't make its effect, right? So there's SSRIs for it, and many different medicines to treat it, and of course, taking SSRIs for that kind of depression will fix the symptoms, right? And it will lead to a better, I guess, a better relation with your everyday life and so on and so forth. But you aren't actually working on understanding why it is that your brain might have developed this deficiency of serotonin reintake. You know what I mean? And a lot of people, they prefer to go from doctor to doctor. This guy, he treated me for a while, but I guess he didn't have the magic key, to unlocking happiness for me. So I'm just going to the next neurologist and the next psychoanalyst or the next psychologist, and so on and so on. And where I think that psychoanalysis has its foot in the door here is that it allows for this kind of deconstruction, right? It allows for this kind of re-entertaining of the reasons behind our afflictions. And that's why I personally, shield psychoanalysis so much, because and we'll go into this when we get into Horntology, right? But it's about re-enunciating the reality of the past, right? Bringing it back into context, and, well, as we've been saying, aesthetizing it, right? I'll give you guys an example of a modern, because I can think of two factions, politically speaking, that have done a great job in aesthetizing politics. And the first one is, of course, the far right, right? I think we can all agree that the far right has done its great job. Trump, Johnson, and so on the head of it, of just aesthetizing the idea of politics, right? But in my country, in Mexico, we've experienced kind of an upset where the far right parties were defeated by a social democratic center left candidate, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and his party, his newly founded third party, Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional, Morena, and they've done a great job at aesthetizing radical politics back into politics again, because so how Trump did this daily conferences, right, which were just like a sham for him to just pump his ego and whatnot. Obrador, he does daily conferences, but he does them at 7 a.m. So a whole different context right there, right? This is before the workday even begins, right? And he does them daily, right? And they are actual press conferences where he gives a brief personally. He doesn't bring people up. I mean, he does bring people up, right? But he leads these conferences in a way much different than how I saw Trump doing it. And through all of these daily conferences, he's always saying, like, for example, 2022 is the year of Ricardo Flores Magón, right? 2021 was the year of he was another historical figure, right? 2020 was another historical figure. And these are all radical figures. Ricardo Flores Magón is actually he's a left anarchist, and the president declared that 2022 was his year. And of course, I mean, we can't pull the wool over our eyes and say, okay, I mean, these are bourgeois politics, right? They aren't fully a reivindication of the working class or anything like that. In fact, this could prove to be very dangerous in a very similar sense to how Bismarck and his social democracy was dangerous to Germany and to the communists, right? But I think we can learn from their way of carrying out politics. So one of the things I wrote also in the text was the war on drugs, right? And needs, right? In Mexico, we call needs ninis, which not underemployment or education, right? That's something kind of what it means in English. In Spanish, it just means ni estudia ni trabaja, and doesn't work, doesn't study. And this talks to the youth. This speaks to the youth of the working class, and I guess the middle class and the bourgeoisie, of course, but people who don't have any kind of employment and any kind of education. And for a long time, the right-wing parties that held power in Mexico, they blamed needs and people who dealt drugs as choosing the wrong moral path. And Obrador, he has changed the policy on both needs and the war on drugs by saying, well, this is pretty much bringing up historical materialism, not literally, of course, but saying like 30 years of neoliberal reform have done this and this. He actually goes up, he explains things, and to quote Walter Benjamin, his thesis 6, he says, to articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. And I think he's doing that in a way. He's bringing back historical fact and recontextualizing it in a way that actually allows for radical politics to happen and for radical politics to make sense, right? For people to be able to identify with radical politics, which I think is something that's missing a lot in the first world. I think that the first world has taken the post-historical pill too hard, and people don't go back. I mean, of course, there are exceptions and very notable exceptions, right, of people who do think these things through. But in general, I feel that this lack of historical reimagining and historical recapturing is one of the big hurdles for the left, for the international left, at least.
I think that.
Yeah, okay, Adam, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that one of the things that's happening, I mean, and I can't speak for every place, but in the United States, is the institutional collapses that are being fostered by, well, the pandemic, but also a number of other things, the decline of U.S. imperialism and decades of neoliberal restructuring that mean there's no redundancy in the system, is leading to a situation where there can be breaks with capitalist realism, but those can go to the left or the right, right? The legacy of Morph is such an enormous topic, because for me, the Locust Review, the journal I'm a part of, was started by a group of people who basically combined Fisher's criticisms of capitalist realism with Michel Louis' idea of critical irrealism. We sort of thought if capitalist realism is in a sense to sort of borrow from and alter Jameson, the cultural logic of neoliberalism or late capitalism instead of postmodernism, maybe the answer is a rejection of realism that aims to be critical. And conceiving of a realism as a kind of counter narrative to the stultifying daily existence of capitalist realism, which has infected left organizations, trade unions, reform, of course, NGOs. There's a political economy to that as well. One of my students, when I was adjuncting at the University of Nevada, and I would have them do a final project in their drawing 2 class, where they came up with, they had to like storyboard and create a character for their own comic that they had to imagine. They created a person who was infected with these sort of mutant tentacles. And in order to keep the tentacles from taking them over, they had to live in a desert to make sure the tentacles were dehydrated. So they were in this constant war with their the infection in their own body, and they had to live in this inhospitable environment. Of course, Las Vegas is in the Mojave Desert and is inhospitable, a terrible place to live. Although vacationing there maybe something else. And I think in a creative sense, I saw this kind of a weaponizing of a subjectivity, of a counter narrative that they've created to deal with the world that is not unrelated to the stuff that's telegraphed at the end of Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. And this is related to the institutional collapses that have been going on in education, healthcare, the logistics industry in the United States, and so on. The fact that labor productivity has gone down 7.5%, and people are quitting their jobs, and we have union drives at Starbucks and at the Amazon Labor Union, and we have a union drive at a Target now. And so it's not the 1930s or anything like that, but it's shifting. And I think this is part of, like, the despair when you can no longer imagine within the confines of capitalist realism an individuated way out. You start to imagine other things. Now, my student imagined this tentacle thing, but I recently met with some people organizing, I don't want to say where because of the nature of it, and they just have nothing left to lose. They can't, their future, if they went to college, they have thousands of dollars of debt. If they didn't go, they have low-wage jobs. So you might as well organize a union. You might as well talk about socialism. You might as well do all these things. And I think that, obviously in terms of art and literature, I mean, the thing that really will break down capitalist realism is social struggle, and actually the rebirth of the politics that were dissembled after the despair of the triumph of capitalism in the 1990s. But I think that in terms of art and literature, we can imagine against, like my student did, imagine against the stultifying every day, right? There's things I'd like to say too about, but I'm going to stop talking for a minute.
I'll just come in quickly to reflect on some of that. One question I really have that I don't think we can go into, but it's more of just a point, because I think we need to move on towards Horntology and away from capitalist realism, because we don't have enough time to really carry on more on capitalist realism. But a question I really have, and it's looking at online subcultures and meme communities, is what has been the effect of Fisher identifying capitalism as a cause of depression? And I think particularly of people who get that far in their understanding of Fisher. I mean, I'm not going to say that's all they understand, but I think there's a difference between also what one understands and what it imprints upon one's mind in terms of affecting one's actions. So I think there are people who really equate Fisher with capitalism equaling depression, and then just get stuck with a depression. And I think it's almost possible to identify new pathologies on this basis. Of course, I won't put it just down to Fisher. I think that generally Fisher identifies something that exists, and generally there is this sentiment, certainly in what we call the West, that capitalism equals suppression and there's no way out. Okay, so Fisher was just giving voice to this, but I think in the sense he's actually reinforcing it, memes have the effect of reinforcing this, because you can only make very direct statements, and it also becomes part of a group mentality. So you solidify your identity within the group by continually putting out memes that simply say we're basically all fucked. And I think that would be one for Ernesto, really, to sort of say whether he thinks that's something that is is that the case as an analyst? Are you seeing that? But I don't know if we can go into that in great depth. But I was thinking also about co-optation, this idea that the capitalist society co-opts co-ops counter-capitalist forces, and I'm wondering if that's what we're seeing with the far right, with Trump supporters, and with QAnon. These people are anti-capitalist all the time. The horrors that they're identifying are the same ones we're identifying, but they also include blood-sucking Democrats. But these are just like they just replaced the figure of the banker with blood-sucking bankers and Democrats that also, but it's basically a skewed anti-capitalism, which of course, in a sense, fascism was as well. And a lot of these movements, and actually they're not even really movements, they're involved in running countries at points, as Trump was, and as you see with the Conservative Party in the UK. A lot of them take straight from the fascist textbook on how to manipulate the public. That is to to seize upon the public's thirst for more wealth and more decision making, and to say that, hey, vote for me and you can take back power, you can build a wall, we can exit the EU and take control of our destinies, and actually then you control the people even more, or just as much as before. So that's a form of cooptation, but I'm wondering to what extent these forms of cooptation are hauntological. And I want to get to what Emma was saying about maybe it's not the time for the acid communist movement. I think part of the acid communist movement was maybe not really ready to go. Maybe something was ready to go. Maybe it wouldn't have been the acid communist movement. But people were angry enough for something to happen. But then suddenly you were hit with the possibility of World War III in this very kind of Cold War way, and this very James Bond, 1980s James Bond way. So we are seeing a kind of hauntological war out in the Ukraine. Of course, if you're in Ukraine, I don't think that's probably a good way to explain it. If you're dealing with it directly, or possibly, I don't know how people see it. But I mean, if you're directly dealing with aerial bombardments and other horrors, you're probably not thinking in these terms at all. But as we're thinking as onlookers, it feels a lot like the nuclear war scares of the 1980s, and it has the same controlling effect, perhaps. So I feel people are distracted right now. They don't want to deal with. I mean, there's a big drop-off in online left activity. I don't mean my own number particularly, but people might notice it across the board. People are focusing on so much, and people are a little bit tired, maybe because of overexposure to online culture during lockdown. But I think maybe people are genuinely just stressed. They got hit with one crisis after another. So I don't know what people think about that, but that ties into hauntology. But if you want to respond briefly to this issue of depression and whether the links being made between capitalism and mental illness are useful, Ernesto or anyone else, that's good. Also maybe get on to hauntology via the Ukraine conflict or war.
Well, going back, sorry, Emma. I'll just answer the thing. So this so depression. So this thing that I've noticed also is that people. So you've seen how when we talk about communism, people don't seem to understand that we're talking about historical development. They seem to think that we're talking about taking one economical system and replacing it with another, right? And I think that's a great parallel to how people are understanding their own depression. Instead of seeing it as like what the example I was giving about the medicine, right? It's not about saying the medicine is useless or anything like that. In fact, I went through my own process where I took antidepressants, and I got cleared. I got cleared because the antidepressants were a kind of a crutch for therapy and for analysis and so on. So instead of being a whole replacement or whatever, it just served as an auxiliary process. And people need to understand that's the kind of critique we're trying to make. We're trying to make an auxiliary critique where we are adding and where we're bringing back and where we're recontextualizing and reforming thought. Instead, it seems that people are stuck on the idea that if it's not one kind of understanding, it has to be another, and that it isn't a kind of a systemic thing. And I feel that this relates a lot with hauntology in the sense that people are kind of looking for one ghost or another, and not understanding that these ghosts have no actual origin except culture and except the present. In fact, that the past that we think that these things come from didn't actually exist. It was a whole different kind of present in that time, and the present that we're living right now has to be recontextualized under a whole new understanding that we might not even have the theory yet to grasp. But that, well, it is like you're saying, Emma. You said this thing about this imperative, right, of having to get up and do something else. But what I'm thinking is kind of an imperative of laying back down and thinking things through, which is something that people They're just trying to look for the new slogan to shout, and that's not the thing. The thing is a more deeper understanding, and that's again, Mike. I can't, of course, talk about any of my analyses, but a lot of the process that I see in the clinic involves that. It's exclusively the idea of rearticulating an entire history around the present, and not just as a kind of a collection of memories, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I guess. Yeah. I mean, I think I get what you're saying there about the Horntology suggesting that we're going back to the past, but we're maybe just revisiting the present and the failure to reconcile certain things in the present. This failure that we've always had, and maybe we could say something very Adornian about how we have to kind of control nature and identify things, and perhaps what we need to try and do is to not identify, to not try and control, and we need to try and lose ourselves, and that could be, that could be facilitated through abstract art, as Adorno said, perhaps through psychedelics, as Fisher hints, although Fisher kind of suggests that we need a psychedelic culture rather than that we all do psychedelics. I don't know why he kind of appeared to sit on the fence there in the introduction to acid communism, but he talks very much about there being a psychedelic culture per se in the 60s in the UK, 60s and 70s, and that coming through on TV and radio. And I think the fact that he also introduces Marcuse there and Adorno in that introduction to acid communism suggests that he is very much looking at psychedelia as an abstraction, as something that disorders, that goes against the tendency to order, and that's also the reason why he has this acid communism, the acid being a modifier of communism in the kind of dictatorial sense. So yeah, I mean, there's a feeling in the way that he suggests there that we need to get into consciousness raising exercises, group seminars, music festivals, etc., that we really just need to lose ourselves in the moment and in each other and in nature. I guess the question still is, how do we get there, or how much closer are we now? And I think it's quite an interesting question, because I mean, I don't like these scenarios, in terms of what would happen if Fisher was still here. But what would happen if anyone had to be responsible for acid communism? Because no one really is. You have figures associated with channels like the Acid Left, the Acid Communism Facebook page, which now has 25,000 followers since this week. I mean, there are these big kind of social media and video, internet streaming outlets, or internet video outlets, however you would call this. Now it's a really boomer thing to say, but internet video sites, YouTube, whatever. There are these places where people talk about acid communism, but nobody is labelled with being the leader or forerunner of acid communism. Of course, there shouldn't probably be a leader, but you'd expect there to be a kind of forerunner, which Fisher would have been. I don't know how he would have shouldered that, because running with Adam the Acid Left for a while, every other question was like, do you do acid? Do you do acid? And it's quite hard to form a movement when that's the question you're always being asked. And I'm not suggesting that people should or shouldn't. I mean, I was always a bit like that because I don't. So I don't want to be the person saying do it. I don't want to be the guy in the corner of a party giving out tabs and not taking any. You know what I mean? So that's why I was always a bit like, well, you can do acid, but I personally, in this moment in my life, I don't. But I believe it's very valuable and useful to people. It has hallucinogens have been in my lifetime. But yeah, I mean, when that's going to be the question, but also the question beyond that, which is a very valid one: how do we actually do this? Disregarding the acid, how do we actually do acid communism? How do we do a movement of consciousness raising on the streets, going and talking to your local pensioners? It can be so many things, because Fisher suggests we have to reach out to everyone, so it doesn't have to be all like jungle music, jungle raves or something like that. There are many different levels, but we have to get out and talk to the people, and then people are like, yes, and it's like, I don't know, like, try it. It really doesn't come out very well, and in terms of talking to the workers, well, I teach in a university. I don't know if that's the audience Fisher intends when he's talking about fostering class consciousness, but I fostered my own in my lifetime or alongside other people. But I'm not going to now go to the supermarket and start talking to the workers. It's difficult to make that leap. So anyway, not to go on too much longer, we still need to kind of bridge through Horntology, but we don't have to do that if people don't have much to say specifically on Horntology. But anyway, how is this going to happen, or can it happen?
Well, I wanted to say something. I stopped taking acid after I got diagnosed with clinical depression and anxiety disorder when I was 19, because I didn't think having a panic attack while I was peaking on acid was a good thing, but there's something about the push and pull of like subjective entities, like in the psychedelic experience, where the flow in between distinct things and the relationship between them shifts, that I think is relevant to both practical Marxist politics, but also cultural matters. I really like the thing that Ernesto said about competing ghosts. And when you go back to Derrida, which is, of course, where Mark Fisher gets the concept of ontology and elaborates it, I think, better than Derrida. And Derrida sort of talks about it as being there and not there at the same time, right? So it's a ghost, it's there, it's not there, and then there's many different ghosts. And of course, people, working class people in particular, I think, are exhausted right now. I mean, obviously, this can depend on situation, industry, country, race, gender, and many other things. But when you're exhausted, you're more likely to see ghosts, right? One of the things that's happened here is that, the tightening of the labor market, partly because they let 1 million people die and there's less people to work, right? Just in the United States, is it's inflated wages, but it's also led to a massive speed up in certain industries. So I was talking to someone who works for a major package handling company. And on the one hand, you can go in and demand a $5 an hour raise and you might get it. But on the other hand, they're making you do things that are literally impossible to do on the shop floor. It's an impossible situation. And that impossible situation can be a step towards something like class consciousness or its opposite, right? It can go in the other direction as well. Similarly, I think therapy can help you find individual solutions. But of course, we know a large share of the population has problems that cannot be solved individually, right? They can only be solved structurally and things like that. So one of the questions I have is, why do so many people believe in the ghosts of individual solutions when that's not a real possibility for them? Part of that is, of course, capitalist ideology and so on. But it's also the fact, for example, in the United States, that did exist for a segment of the working class population, white male workers, for part of the 19th century and for the years of the post-war boom. Not everybody, and not even all white male workers, but a majority of white male workers could materially have a better life, either through colonization in the 19th century or through the fact the United States was producing most of the world's industrial goods during the post-war boom. And I think, what are the other ghosts? Because those are ghosts, but there's also the ghosts of the wildcat strikes in the 70s and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. There's the ghost of Sherman's March to the Sea when the plantations were burned down and Black people took up arms against slavery and so on. And so I think one of the things for me, in terms of like an acid communism combined with a kind of like left or subaltern ontology, is how these things exist in a push and pull together. Like something we call like the Locust Review, and also others, including afterwards, surrealists have talked about as a differentiated totality. That it's not just one thing. It's not like the muscular male worker with a hammer and sickle or whatever. It's diverse. It's a huge, something the poet Richard Hamilton calls discordant will, an expression of these subjectivities going in and out of each other against this hostile totality that takes on different names, the capitalist ideology, capitalist realism, and stuff like that. So I really like the idea of competing ghosts, and I'm curious, if other folks want to talk about competing ghosts. But whatever, sorry.
I wanted to pick up on something that I kind of noticed as a thread between Adam and Ernesto, and kind of bring a few different pieces together. Ernesto, your remarks about your friend who doesn't want to think of ADD or ADHD as anything other than an individual condition, it sounds like. And the sense that I get from that is that this friend is kind of keeping this condition within the remit of their control, basically. Like, okay, so when you envision your mental health problem or your particular condition or disorder, what have you, as being fully neurobiological rather than cultural or socially instantiated, you also give yourself full control over it. Like, okay, I take this pill or I go see this doctor or what have you. And the cause for this is it's genetic or it's inexplicable. It is simply inexplicable, but there are things that can be done and I just need to do that. It's a way of keeping it close to you. It's a way of individualizing and privatizing it, essentially. And Adam, your story about your students who came up with this character, like the mutant with tentacles that they kind of like, they're always there, the tentacles, but they have to remain in this like desiccated condition in order for them not to like choke you, I guess. So you have to live in this hostile environment. In both cases, somebody is taking a condition and in their minds wrapping themselves fully around it, basically, privatizing it. Mm-hmm. And I think that is what happens, or rather, I think that we're in a moment where even though there's a lot of conversation about the social determinants of mental health, and there's this interest in Mark Fisher's work. Of course, he was so committed to exploring that. Because social media, the internet, cultivates, I think, a very sort of private bourgeois subjectivity where we're all kind of competing with each other and we all kind of venerate these statistics and this like map of ourselves that's very individual based on tastes and likes and profiles. The discourse might be about, Fisher's ideas, but even among like left-leaning people who are quite depressed or who are suffering from X, Y, and Z, not on the level of discourse, but maybe more on the level of affect on the unconscious, not in like the Freudian sense, which is kind of like a more just your unconscious mind more generally. We have this sense that everything is very individual, and we have this sense of guilt, perhaps, that we can't just like, make ourselves happy, or that we can't like, even if intellectually we understand that, our depression has something to do with capitalism, I think there is still some sense that it's our fault and it's essentially like a private or individual problem. So, to try to put that in dialogue, basically with this idea of where our ghosts are and this idea that we're being revisited by the past, I actually think that we're living basically in this kind of constant like non-time where like everything that is real basically feels like a ghost to us. Like we're always like imagining that we are like online a lot, because we are online a lot, especially people like watching this stream are probably online a lot. I think we're very much trapped like in this individual present non-time, and our connection to things that feel real is sort of like basically spectral. So, our connection to what's going on in Ukraine now, whether or not we associate it with the Cold War, and for people under a certain age, that connection is not going to be there. Even for me, I like it's not very like tangible, and I'm not like super young or anything. But I guess it's kind of a matter of like, how do we vanquish ghosts and kind of like make the present feel more real, I guess, and like kind of overcome our individual sense of realness and the real to connect with like the external real of other people. And that's kind of getting into Lacanian territory too, I guess.
Yeah,
it was a bit all over the place, but yeah.
It's a good point. I mean, I'm not very well up on Lacan, but just to say that you have a good point about this digital reality that doesn't seem very real, and I think that's a very good point, especially with regard to the topic of the discussion, the legacy of Mark Fisher, because he's just become very online. Like when you say people are too online or terminally online, Fisher's kind of, how can we say, the kind of the fetish of Fisher, as a fetish, as a commodity fetish, is one that's very online, and that kind of adds a new dimension, because commodity fetish already projected a reality about an object that isn't actually there, but you're doing that through a medium that isn't there either. So it's kind of once removed even from an author like Marx, who from when he died, or from when he was publishing in his lifetime to very recently, was a book. You had this brick of a book, Das Kapital, and it was, there was an abstraction, because it was like Marx meant so much more than the book. So you did have this kind of, this kind of commodity fetish. But I think it seemed more real than Fisher does now. And of course, Marx to some degree suffers the same fate, becoming a meme. But I think with Fisher, I don't know why it's to a higher degree. I think just because people have chosen him as a kind of a symbol of their own perhaps depressive state, and it's kind of funny or telling that he in Capitalist Realism talks about, again returning to what I said at the beginning, the depressive hedonia of his students, and by that he means a depressed hedonism. And he speaks specifically of his students that are playing PlayStation and smoking too much weed and don't have time to read Nietzsche, he says. And I think actually that's very significant. Now I'm writing an essay on Nietzsche for a compendium, which is being edited by Matt McManus, and I'm writing it right now. The deadline is the end of this month. I'm realizing why that might be, because Nietzsche was very much about living in the moment, beyond his overman, which is like a highly confused overman or Superman that that then ended up taking on fascist tones for no fault of his own, perhaps, or definitely for no fault of his own. The overman also became a man or person who could take on the moment by saying yes to all of reality. So it's a person who can deal with the present, and he really gets to this in the Antichrist. So it's in the last year that he was actually publishing, and among his last 3 books, somebody who can say yes to now. Who he talks about Christ at that moment, and in the Antichrist he actually says that Christ is the only person equal to himself, as being somebody who realizes the need to live completely in the now and say yes to reality. And he talks about Christ bearing on the cross, the way that he just accepts his fate. Okay, so I think that he's saying that his students can't read Nietzsche or haven't got the time to read Nietzsche. At the same time, he's saying that they're too much fixated with their PlayStations and smoking pot because they precisely can't live in the moment. And he's talking about that, and he's talking also about how everything gets co-opted by capitalism, and then he has become co-opted, but as a meme in his passing, after he passed away. So there are all these kind of like contradictions and traps, and it's all very hauntological as well. So that all came off what Emma was saying. But yeah, I think the key here, I mean, with Legacy right now is, well, actually, it's kind of not disappointing because it's not his fault, but it's kind of it's worrying because it represents so much, of the problem we face as left theorists in general, and as people hopefully trying to make actual left movements as well. I suppose that the answer to how does Fisher become useful is the answer just to how we become useful as leftists generally, and a lot of that is to do with how we get offline. But this always comes back to me when I get to this in discussions, and I don't think it will come from any of you, but often from successful leftist podcasters, that hey, it's like we're not really saying we're making a movement. We are podcasters, and everyone has a role, you know. And I kind of buy that to some degree, but then you'd have to be a podcaster who is still promoting a movement, who is still, you know, getting people to organize and to become organs of a movement. Okay, so, you know, somebody is the kind of bubbly, talkative one who's, you know, who has a way with people, so you go and you talk to the workers. Somebody is great online, so you do the online stuff. That doesn't mean you don't have to make a movement. You do the online stuff with a view to getting the right people out in front of the workers. And of course the workers themselves acting for themselves. So to some degree you need to actually get the workers to tell us what should be happening. But it doesn't mean that, you know, you get to just podcast and say, well, you know, that's kind of my role. It's not, that's not your role as a leftist if you're actually distracting people from doing anything useful for the movement, for making a movement. So I get quite frustrated with this thing of being you know, part of the online left. Then I think it's somehow, you know, projection, because I get frustrated at everyone else when I think, oh, actually it's also me. I mean, I try and do stuff locally with the local left party, which literally is called the Left Party, but in Finnish. But it's slow going. But anyway, I don't know what anyone thinks about any of that.
I can make a few brief comments. I know I just spoke, but so it's kind of interesting, you know, regarding Mark Fisher's legacy, because unlike Marx and unlike most theorists that are going to be the, you know, bread and butter of the discourse, he really started his career online, and he's always been an online figure. You know, with his blog, he was one of the eminent members of the blogosphere in the early 2000s, as far as I understand. I mean, when he began the K-punk blog, you know, I was barely in high school. I was, you know, really little. So in a way, it actually makes sense that his legacy would have this very online presence, basically, that it would be this very online thing. I think the problem, though, is that the internet has changed dramatically from, I think it was like 2001 or 2002 when he started his blog, and like the late 90s into now. I mean, it has become very little other than a repository for currency and a producer of like literal capital currency. And it, it's turned in many ways into the opposite, I think, of the space that he wanted it to be. So there's that. And that can kind of connect to one of the big questions that's on the table, which is, how do we do acid communism? Like, what does it really look like? I think we have to get comfortable with the idea that we're not going to know, all of us, about it when it happens in various moments and instantiations, because we're all very acclimated now to this idea of a world stage. I follow leftist organizers on Twitter. I like to see the union leaders. I like to see people making connections between Marxism and feminism and mental health and the climate crisis and all of that, and having a big impact through podcasting or through, organizing in a much more like so-called real world way. And we believe that, our connection to political change is through this spectacle and through, the veneration of statistics, the numbers and the images and everything. When in fact, I think a lot of it will actually take place offline, off social media. A lot of it will be local. With the way that the world is going, things are not going to get any easier. And I do think that the conditions for local leftist organizing are, only growing more ripe, and people are growing sort of more frustrated and pissed off in ways that are making them, like Adam was talking about, get together, because they have literally nothing to lose. But if we're sitting here in our homes in different places and we're not seeing that so much, we may get the sense that it's not really happening. So that's like basically like an existential problem with politics. So yeah.
I think Adam has a point. Yeah, Adam.
Oh yeah, I think that they're not to idealize the early in that, but there's definitely a closure that happens from 2000 to 2010, where it becomes very centralized. And while it seems like democratic, rhizomatic space or whatever, it is not. The code is very much not. And you see this in the writing of Jody Dean, who talks about communicative capitalism and how like the use value of communicative capitalism has shifted from like sending one message to one group of people and so on to an aggregation of data, right? So in some ways it doesn't matter what's said as long as things are said, the algorithm continues to work. We also see it's tilted towards the right, like in the studies by Jen Schrade, Ruha Benjamin stuff on the code, the ideology of code and race, or David Columbia's stuff on the ideology of Bitcoin. And also the fact that it sort of decontextualizes everyone in it and atomizes them and so on. And I think it sort of creates a situation where anti-capitalist gestures of various kinds within the framework of social media become capitalist, anti-capitalist gestures. And of course, that might be true to the extent in any cultural gesture within capitalism, eventually through reification and cooptation and so on. But it happens in a particular way on digital platforms, tied both to the ideology of the people who created the internet. If you look at Barbara Cameron's The Californian Ideology essay from the mid-1990s, which I always think of in my head along with the Dead Kennedy song, California Uber Alles, talking about the right-wing libertarian utopianism that came from a cross-fertilization of Reaganism and hippies, and so on, which I suppose would confirm Mark Fisher's antipathy toward hippies, and so on. But there's also like the famous, well, I don't know if it's famous, but from Walter Benjamin, the idea of describing fascism as expression without rights. And I don't think the internet's fascist, but it kind of is expression without rights. And so, for example, like we were talking about exiting the vampire castle or earlier, you can't, I don't think, from my point of view, have an effective anti-capitalism without feminism, queer liberation, and anti-racism being, and anti-imperialism being central. Look at what's happening in the U.S. right now, where we might lose abortion rights for more than half of the country. It's going to be a catastrophe, particularly for working class women. But a lot of times the gestures around these things online don't flow from a strategy, a democratically determined strategy from a social movement, or even an undemocratic kind of Leninist strategy, right? Historically on the left, but from the way they're structured is by the algorithm. And the algorithm is determined by both capitalist political economy and ideology. So that's, I think, the structure of it. And that raises a series of other questions. For example, you can't ignore this communicative space, this cultural space. You can't just cede that ground to the right and to capitalist realism and so on. But both in terms of culture and in terms of quote unquote practical organizing, that space cannot be a substitute for things happening in the real world. In terms of culture, you have the flip issue, which is the digital stuff seems to have this democratic access aspect to it, whereas like the analog IRL space seems to have like authenticity and aura or something in the Benjaminian sense. But these are increasingly rarefied bourgeois spaces, right? I mean, they always were a little bit, but it's even more so now. If you look at like the mid-range art galleries in New York failing, so you have a polarization of the art market and so on. So I think that raises the question, again, of going back and forth between digital and analog and figuring out how to conflate and contradict those things in a critical way. But also then bringing back the centrality of, I can't remember where it's from. I remember it in Acid Left meme, and I remember reading it. But the notion from Fisher that whether the working class is still the subject of revolutionary change, if we act like it is, we'll find the subject of revolutionary change. And so again, it goes back to the people organizing the Starbucks, organizing against this repeal of abortion rights for half the United States, people fighting U.S. imperialism. The very last thing I'll say is I think that you have competing ghosts again. There's a ghost war. On the one hand, history weighs like a night mirror on the brains of the living. But on the other hand, in both Fisher and Derrida's like Horntology, there's the idea of evoking lost futures, particularly past ideas of possible future utopias, post-capitalist utopias. So like you want to raise one set of ghosts and you want to exercise others, right? So I don't think it's just picking one ghost or another and then connecting those ghosts again to real life struggles, you know. Anyway, sorry, I'll stop talking.
No, it's good. I mean, I think we have time for a few more points if anyone has any, because I think we're not going to reach resolution in the previously allotted time. So I would give us another few minutes, or you know, we can all go around again at least. Yeah, if anyone has questions in the public there, feel free to ask and we will respond. Questions or points. Yeah, so I mean it's a big topic. I think the thing is, when we're talking about the legacy of Mark Fisher, we're talking not really just about the legacy of Mark Fisher, we're talking about digital culture and the publishing industry, which is changing fast. And I don't mean who owns the rights to Fisher, because I don't think that's particularly interesting for us right now. You know, but more just, you know, the way things are changing with these kind of Patreon hybrids of publishing and, you know, other forms. I know, I think really the last year, you know, it's become apparent that there will be an explosion in small imprints and in subscription style imprints. But generally, I think the issue of Fisher's legacy is one that covers so many subjects pertinent to our time, perhaps because he just saw things very clearly, but also he was very much on the cusp of, you know, things changing, and kind of hinted at things changing, and then sadly departed us, and then things just changed hugely in many different ways that he kind of had nearly kind of foreseen. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is him saying that, you know, that not that there's no alternative, but that it's said that there's no alternative, and is there one? And he's talking about neoliberalism obviously throughout, and he says neoliberalism. And now, you know, are we really in neoliberalism? In a way we are, but it's just got a kind of neo-fascist face. But in a way, it feels very much that we're moving away from that. And then you think, well, you know, things can change. They can change more. So it's this kind of exciting time, but it's not one I want to be in. You know, in many ways, because it's just kind of scary, right? As well. But yeah, that was some scattered reflections. But you know, in terms of us saying that, you know, what is the legacy of Fisher? That's a difficult job. It's almost like saying, what's going to happen next? But I suppose also the question is, how is he useful? Is it good, bad that he's been co-opted in a way? Obviously, there's kids getting into Fisher through memes, so I would say it's good in many ways. But yeah, I suppose the question to get any kind of closure in the next 10 to 20 minutes is, how do we make, you know, what we understand of Fisher, how do we make that useful for the counterculture? Does anyone have any ideas? And it can also be, Ernesto, in terms of psychoanalysis, not just the counterculture, in terms of underground movements.
Well, while we think for an answer, because I'm also thinking about it, I have some remarks about something Emma said a couple of minutes ago. So you were making these allusions, right, to how people understand their own unconscious and how they relate to it. And I think that it's no coincidence that people seem to have taken this dichotomy between the highly individualized Freudian unconscious and this idea of a transcendental shared unconscious in Jung and this whole new wave idea. And a lot of this comes, of course, from misunderstanding of Freud, right? When you actually read Freud, you realize that Freud also has this conception of a shared unconscious, but he doesn't think that we have like a mystical, realm of unconsciousness where we all go. He just thinks that the unconscious is shared in the same way that culture is shared, right? It's not that we have either a perfectly parallel unconscious between any two people, but more so that the unconscious, much in the same way as mannerisms and patterns of speech and so on, it's inherited, right? It's passed on. It's a ghost also that haunts us, and people don't they don't relate to it. They alienate themselves from this ghost, and they again here an allusion to Lacan, right, to his famous remark on May 68, right, about how protesters weren't actually revolutionizing anything, but they were just asking for a new master, right? And it seems that in a way, especially, we are discussing a kind of a new master, right? In a sense, of course. But what we're talking about is not letting ourselves be possessed by this ghost of Fisher, but rather to understand its origins, maybe. If that's even possible, right? But at least what actually falls to us is to understand how these ghosts how they cross us, right? How they I don't know what the word in English, but that's the kind of term I'm trying to how they go through us, right? And how they completely in a manner of a lens, like how they completely change our understanding of reality. And it's a manner of like Zizek says, of looking ori, right? Taking a moment, stepping to the side, and looking at this lens from a different angle, and actually being able to understand how the distortions work. It's not about smashing the lens, about exorcising the ghosts. That's I think that's not what we're talking about. I think that what we're talking about is coming back to Nietzsche, actually taking the proper understanding of the overman and being filled to the brim with ghosts, right? Saturated with ghosts, but in a way that doesn't overwhelm us, that speaks to humanity, that speaks to the history that's been handed down to us. Yeah, that's right, Mike. Sorry, I was just reading the chat. Yeah, we do need some insults because it's really funny how people get really standoffish on the internet and very opinionated about how I see a lot of people actually talking specifically about the meaning of Mark Fisher, right? And so I was, you guys, I don't know if you guys know Plastic Pills, this YouTuber that also does theory, and he has a small Discord. He has a Discord, and people talk about it, about stuff there and theory there, and it all has this air of erudition, I guess. But a couple of days ago, we were talking specifically about the meaning of Mark Fisher, and one of the users was going on and on, writing paragraphs on their opinion on the meaning of Mark Fisher, condemning it for this and that. And I just thought, have you read it? Like, have you actually read the meaning of? No, of course they hadn't. Of course they hadn't.
Yeah, I didn't know if you were talking about the phenomenon of people meaning Mark Fisher or the book I wrote with that name.
No, I'm talking about your book.
Or the spoof of my book.
Right, a whole other thing, right?
Yeah, people do get upset. But yeah, there's been good responses as well, and it's done pretty well. But yeah, people get angry about the book being called The Meaning of Mark Fisher. So if anyone doesn't know who's watching, I wrote a book called The Meaning of Mark Fisher on the fact that Mark Fisher gets memed, and a lot of people got very upset. And there were people, a lot of them adjacent to repeater books, and other people from the UK, they got very upset on Twitter. And then a few months later, some other people in the US got upset on Instagram, and they made a spoof copy of my book before it came out and pretended that their book was the original meaning of Mark Fisher. And I just caught up with some people who made that spoof, and they said things to me like, you seem old and you don't know, you don't really understand meme culture and all this stuff. It was very silly stuff. So I confirmed that the reasoning behind making that spoof, it was really just daft. There was nothing really there, but they didn't like that I was talking about memes and not them, basically. I got some brilliant screenshots of this person saying this kind of thing. One of the people who made that spoof. Anyway, people get upset. Yeah, I mean, there were two main things happening. People get upset because they think Mark Fisher shouldn't be memed. They think my book was saying he should be. And then people who meme Mark Fisher, who think that I was against the memeing of Mark Fisher, against him being a meme. So you've got these two extremes. And actually, I was really neither. I was saying, like, this is what's happening, and it has its good and bad aspects. So yeah, but as I wrote it just now in the chat, like, any questions, any points, any insults, because I would have expected, something, but no. I think the internet is very factionalized. I've seen that in the last couple of years, that you're on Instagram, you're on Twitter, or you're here or you're there, and these audiences don't come over now. On Twitter, people aren't hating on me so much. On Instagram, they are. We don't seem to have that Insta crowd with us today. But yeah,
it is the middle of the workday.
Thanks for bringing that up. But yeah, it's the middle of the workday there. Yeah, in Europe it's like
midnight,
11 p.m. in Central Europe, and it's 10 p.m. here in Finland. But Finland doesn't really have this argument. Yeah.
I want to. Oh, Adam, were you?
No, you go ahead.
Okay, this is probably. I don't think this will take too long. So, Ernesto, you were talking about the unconscious, and I mean, the internet is our collective unconscious made flesh. You think about what you do online, you bring different levels of intention to it, but largely I think people are kind of in automatic mode when they're so habituated to checking their apps and opening their email, and you're not bringing your full attention there in a way that we could call fully conscious use, which really has made the internet this unconscious, this place that we're all kind of like swimming in each other's unconscious minds all the time, which turns out to be a lot more boring than I would have thought it was. We're living in a different world where the unconscious, or rather where the internet didn't exist. But
repression. That's everything.
Yeah. So, we're constantly being exposed to other people's unconscious drives and interests and activities, because we're interacting with each other online all the time and seeing what people are posting and liking and so on and so forth. And I keep coming back to this idea that you can't really understand acid communism if you don't have a strong sense for Mark Fisher's relationship with what he called the weird and the eerie, or the two concepts. The weird and the eerie are not the same thing for him. He lays it out very clearly in the book called The Weird and the Eerie. And I think that part of what an acid communist program requires is a strong sense for the importance of the weird defined as the indefinite, as it were, something totally novel and radical, like a strange kind of an otherness that really can't be assimilated, basically. And this has resonances with horror. Horror as a genre in film and literature and all that. I think it's basically impossible for us to have weird experiences online, because we are drawn into this sort of collective space that rehearses things that are familiar, things that don't connect us to our own kind of like intuitive imaginal realm, if you will. Like, if we have it in us to have kind of groundbreaking weird experiences, whether through the ingestion of psychedelic drugs or aesthetic experiences, encounters with art, that faculty, I think, is not really exercised online. And this may be my bias as a really dedicated, hopefully tech-savvy Luddite. The fact that we are so like in each other's minds online, I think actually like de-weirds our daily experiences in a way that makes the whole acid communist program much more remote, basically, much more impossible to achieve. So that's all.
I have a thought on that, actually. Oh, sorry. Go on.
I can wait.
Hold on. All right, okay. Well, I'll go quickly because otherwise I think I'm going to forget this. In the sense, I'm not going to be able to make it coherent if I wait for a while. So this thing about the weird not being online, I agree, or the online not being weird in a good way, I guess. I don't know. I kind of see what you're saying, but I think that there is an aspect of the human subconscious which attaches to objects and gives objects animalistic properties. The kind of experience where somebody can imagine that objects have powers as a way of explaining how things happen because they don't want to really admit how they really happen, or they can't explain but they need an answer, or something's going wrong in their life, so they make a whole narrative around objects and people. That is pure fantasy. I think that part of that is shifted online, so that you get a situation where perhaps you can feel that it's the memes or it's the tweets doing something, that they can be responsible for what actually are your neuroses or psychoses. So I think the internet is weird in that way. I think that there's a lot coming up on TikTok and Instagram in terms of witchcraft, New Age, spirituality, etc. On TikTok, there's this practice of, I forget the name now. I'm sure I mentioned it in the book as well, in Meaning of Mark Fisher. It's kind of a displacement. It's a word like that, but basically, people thinking that just before sleep, you can get into a trance. That means that when you sleep, you will change dimensions and you'll really be in this other dimension. But that it can be anything. If you want to go and live in the Harry Potter world, you can do that. And you've got these TikToks of people waking up and going straight on TikTok and crying and saying, I was in the Harry Potter dining hall and I was living there. I went away for 6 years and now I'm back here the day after I went to sleep, and they're really upset that they come back to our reality. Shifting, it's called TikTok shifting, but the practice is just called shifting. And there are other kind of worrying practices going on. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of weirdness on the internet, but maybe it's not the weirdness that Fisher was talking about. It was perhaps more organic and not forced.
Sorry.
Yeah, go on. No, go on now. Yeah.
I think some of that stuff, like the shifting phenomenon on TikTok, can go in radically two different directions. Like it can be very degenerative, like in the sense of the occult, right-wing occultism, and so on. But it also, I think, can reflect a desire to not be in an insufferable current world. I think that the colonization of, it's our collective subconscious, but it's also the colonization of our collective subconscious by capital. And it's also skewed by class. So even though most people of all classes are on the internet, like in the United States, for example, usage by people goes down substantially. Regular usage goes down substantially by social class. Half of young people in the United States are on TikTok, but half aren't. And it's almost entirely a class divide. Twitter is overwhelmingly professionals, particularly in the United States, and so on. So that also, if it is our collective subconscious, it's also skewed by who participates the most in it. And I also think the way it's, I'm against very much any kind of genre essentialism, or technological, everything that is this or that is either progressive or reactionary, and so on. But the way it is currently structured, there's sort of an unpoetic ephemerality to it, because it's constant search for new input and data for the aggregation political economy and also the ideology that surrounds it. So a lot of what could possibly be poetic and meaningful and weird and eerie or critical in these corporate digital spaces aren't. At the same time, I think the churn, is starting to produce a Gothic and Auric internet. If you think about like GeoCities, the old AOL page, Live Journal, and so on. And that can both, of course, raise reactionary as well as critical, uncanny impulses. I think part of making the legacy of Mark Fisher, just part of making the legacy of Fisher's critique of capitalist realism useful is creating space to not be useful. Space to be outside the utter enclosure of both the digital and physical commons by capitalism. I'm not a surrealist because I think our brains our subconscious is so colonized by capitalist ideology that just pushing out our subconscious at this point isn't particularly critical, because we're so embedded with capitalist ideology. But I think there's something to creating that space and automatic processes where it's not about how am I, one, furthering the movement or furthering my own career or making money or does this work, like where we actually exist and even make things without a sense of purpose. But I also, one of the reasons I'm an irrealist is that I think that needs to be critical of the world as it is. And irrealism is a catch-all term for like speculative fiction, Afro-surrealism, surrealism, absurdism, and so on, to like weaponize that impractical solidarity in a way. And the last thing I want to say about it, I mean, there's other things you can say about it, like the ghosts, all the historic ghosts of utopias, like the idea of Lubberland, or Big Rock Candy Mountain, the McClintock song, where the trees are growing food. And, well, actually, they do that. That's not absurd, but like where nobody owns them, and so on. Aesthetic leveling in early hip hop and early punk music, and things like that. But I think also being with the working class, the subaltern, the oppressed, like in proximity, content, form, impulse, practical solidarity, I think that is also key to making it useful. So like have like a way to connect up art and cultural gestures to the people organizing the Starbucks, to the people protesting the police murders, and so on. Art's not going to change anything, but it can help the songs that are sung, right, on the barricades, right, or something like that. Anyway.
Yeah. What was that line from Brecht?
Right.
It was, will there be singing in the dark times? And then I think it's that dialogue in a play. So somebody says, will there be singing in the dark times? And the response says, yes, there will be singing in the dark times about the dark times. So yeah, I don't know where that really leaves us. I mean, generally, I mean that quote, I've thought about that over the years, and is that a good or bad thing? So yeah, there's going to be entertainment, there's going to be music, but it's going to be about the shit that we're in. Does that make it okay? Does that make it a bit better?
It's honest.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the statement is honest, yeah, but is it you're like, are you okay because you're singing through the troubles, and you're singing about the troubles because you're consumed in that moment. I mean, at least going back to this thing of Nietzsche and Fisher, is that you're in the moment when you're doing that, because singing and art is a very good way of being in the moment. Aside from the fact that there's so much about it being a subconscious process, but you could go back to what Adam said, about maybe we don't want to be, that we don't want to be, getting on with our subconsciouses. That isn't that helpful. We want to be getting on with the reality, perhaps. I'm not quite sure if I understood Adam completely, but I think singing is a way of grounding ourselves in the now, and then at least you're in the now. And then Nietzsche would say, well, if you can say yes to everything, then basically you have it made. If you can say yes to the now, and to any now, then that's kind of, you have it made, which is kind of very, very Buddhist. But Nietzsche at points made allusions to needing a European Buddhism. So I guess that fits. But yeah, okay. So that's my answer to my own question. I think, yeah, okay. At least if we can sing about the shit we're in or make art about it, then that's some consolation.
Well, it gives us a place to converge on. You know, we need spaces of collectivity, and if we have music and if we have art, even if we're not bringing in the future in our songs and in our paintings, at least people are there together in the now. And I think that's something that's very important, especially in this post-COVID moment, for people to get together in the real world in particular, and if not in the real world, at least in real time. You know, that that helps to kind of create the consciousness, you know, to put it in a sort of loose way, that I think is really necessary. And going to concerts, going to art events will always be a source of community and a source of hope that, you know, at a very baseline feeds the spirit, you know, regardless of whether it's like a Rage Against the Machine concert or like a psychedelic folk concert where people are talking about like utopias or singing about utopias. You know, it almost doesn't matter, I think, in a way, as long as people are together.
Yeah, and it's funny now that we're talking about this digital age, because it seems that the internet kind of helps us stay apart. I mean, we're right here, right, in the same screen, same viewer, but I mean, we're thousands of miles apart, and we, of course, I mean, we are leftists. We're trying to think through some kind of togetherness, but normally, any typical person will use the fact that somebody else is on the screen to differentiate themselves from them, right? So I can say, oh, like, that's Mike Watson. He does this. He writes this. He lives there, and that makes him so different from me that, you know, that's him, and this is me. And things like what you're talking about, music, art, that blurs the lines between people. And we need to, I guess, fight against the current in the sense of trying to find a way in the digital to blur those lines and to step away from all of the profiling and styling and whatnot into I don't want to say a mesh or something like that, but you know, kind of a stew.
Yeah, I mean, there is potential there. Whereas, you know, I could go, Adam, you go and hold a concert tonight in your town, and Emma, you go and take some acid with a few people, and Ernesto, you go and have some radical consciousness of, you know, raising exercise.
DMT, let's say.
Yeah, okay. And I'll go and do something else, and you know we're all doing that in our different zones, hometowns. And if we do that on a big scale, so we have Conrad Hamilton going and doing something, Doug Lane's going and doing something, and we roll it out to everybody, then that would be pretty massive. And that obviously is something that can be achieved online. It's kind of how they run elections, how the Sanders campaign and the Corbyn campaign ran, not to great effect, but you know, it was still something to see them do as well as they did with the policies they had. But we don't do it out of election time, and there really is that potential, you know, for us to do that on a rolling basis, to have some kind of interface in which we all log on, and we're like, you know, we need some, you know, we need a protest march about this here, whilst we need some memes about this here, and we need, you know, we could be coordinating this all the time, but I don't know. I think the question there would be who would set this thing up, you know. It gets tricky because it will become factional very quickly. I don't know how you get around the fact that Conrad is a contemporary Stalinist, as Doug Lane recently called him, and Adam maybe isn't, etc. It would need us to resolve a lot of things, I think, maybe before we can make a platform like that possible. But I think, you know, it's really worth trying. Well, I've been saying it so long, but I just don't have the tech skills to actually make a platform like that. I mean, you could effectively, we could use any kind of, there's so, you know, we could use a Google Doc, you know, so I suppose it doesn't really need the tech skills. Yeah, okay, so maybe that's something that could happen.
I guess one of the things Jen Schrady found in her study of left and right social media usage in North Carolina in the 2010s was that one of the reasons the right wing was more successful is they didn't have to worry about repression and state surveillance and things like that. Whereas a lot of the labor organizers and civil rights organizers in North Carolina were, of course, Black, and had to worry a great deal about police repression and being public and so on. I think, like, we're having, for example, at the Born Again Labor Museum, we're having a cookout and making protest materials for one of the emergency actions tomorrow around the possible repeal of abortion rights. We can broadcast that right now fairly safely, although in the future I'm not sure. But there's other things that we can't let people know about, not because they're illegal or anything, but because of repression. From either employers or you know what I mean? I'm being a little bit vague, but so like figuring out the balance between that. But I totally agree that like connecting up the local IRL in real life stuff with the digital is very important, because neither can be sacrificed. They're both very, very important, and I'm not sure how to get the balance right. I know that like what Mike said about the factionalism thing is true. I try to be as non-sectarian as I can be, but sometimes it's very difficult because other people might not agree with you about not sectarian.
I missed the topic. I had to open my blind because I was sitting in the darkness there. I would love it to be dark now, but it doesn't actually get dark at this time of year in Finland.
Oh, right.
It looks like it's getting dark, but it's basically just it's just the way the window is facing the garden. Still pretty light out. But were you talking more about that kind of platform or situation, Adam, or had you moved on from that?
Well, I talked about the issue of security, particularly in a country like the United States that is so repressive, particularly towards Black people. But also, like some of the anti-abortion laws that will be put into place will make it illegal, for example, for women to go out of state to get an abortion, or for people to help them. It's this kind of like legacy of some of the fugitive slave laws in those same states a while ago. Yeah. So I was talking about issues of security, but I was saying I agree that trying to figure out how to make the in real life stuff dovetail with the digital stuff is extremely important, because both are key, and then I just said that we should try to not be sectarian about it.
Well, I think that's kind of maybe not quite the point we should close on, but maybe we could actually do that. Maybe there are ways of doing that. I think it's close to something we can close on, because why aren't we able to take the online stuff and coordinate so that we're also doing stuff in real life? That we are, that Ernesto is doing something in real life that coordinates somehow with what I'm doing in real life, but what I'm doing won't be the same because I'm dealing with a small city in the north of Finland, and Ernesto's in Mexico, so there's different needs, but we could still broadly internationally cooperate on what we're doing in these different locales. So I strongly believe that would be worthwhile. It's something me and Adam Ray Adkins of the Acid Left talked about. We didn't quite get there. I'm not really active with the Acid Left. I mean, I kind of am behind. I didn't really give up the Instagram, and actually, I have got the ability to post on the YouTube. It's kind of vague, but I mean, anyway, I'm not really very active with the Acid Left. But that's not. I don't mean in that sense we didn't really get there, but we just didn't really quite work out, the details of how that would happen. But anyway, any kind of other closing point other than it would be great if we could, coordinate our online activities into real life.
I would say just let's not forget that organizing completely outside of the digital is also a whole other thing, right? So, for example, Corbin, right? He organized online, and I'm sure he organized in person also, but he didn't actually win, right? And I'm not going to do a diagnosis on his strategy right now, but the comparison that I do want to make is that Andrés Manuel, the Mexican president that actually won, he also did what he did is that he actually, in person, he visited every city of the country, like literally every city of the country. He went in person and he talked to local leaders and he mobilized them. for his movement, and he's the president of Mexico now. So I think that we have to step back from the computer a little bit and look around and see where we can go, what we can do locally. And this isn't something nobody here isn't saying, but I'm just trying to reiterate it. And if wherever you are, whatever you're doing, find, I guess, a book club, at least a food kitchen or a food drive. Even cleaning streets, because it's not about finding the effective communist solution to politics. It's about keeping the connections going, keeping the conversations going, because I don't think that we have to necessarily organize online. I mean, of course we have to organize, but as long as we are still talking and still treating each other as equals, I think that's the first step. And if we're doing that, we're already doing something right.
Yeah, if I can just tack on to that, I absolutely agree that actions that might feel small or inconsequential are actually going to be the bread and butter of the future. And I think that the digital age has given us this consciousness that if we are not attracting a huge number of followers and having a measurable impact, and not only a measurable impact, but one with a quantitatively very large impact, that our actions are kind of meaningless and that we shouldn't pursue them. It's almost like we have a very neoliberal consciousness about how to do politics. Like, we need to be addressing the biggest issue. We need to define the biggest issue and find the best possible strategy for it. We need to write the book that's going to say it all, or join the movement that has everything perfect ideologically, or something like that. And you can waste a lot of energy thinking about those things and going down rabbit holes online, when there are a group of leftists in your town, there's a soup kitchen, there's something like that. And just by meeting those people and staying in touch with them, that is like doing the work, keeping the conversation and the relationships going, basically. So yeah, I'm just emphasizing what Ernesto said, basically putting it in.
Yeah, I mean, I think then you're both right. I think that something changes when you speak to people in person, and when there are groups of people who get together, something happens that's very different to online contact. But also, I think, if you're talking about something like Marxist alienation, that you can root that in the experience of alienation of people, rather than telling people you're alienated because Marxists said so, and that means this, and this. Quoting Marx, you can root it in the experience, and that's something we're not able to do if we're distant from reality. And I think in that sense, the online left has become the new academic left, the left that wants the credentials of being left, but isn't, actually getting their hands dirty with the reality of meeting people and doing things. So that's very important. Yeah, I mean, you have to, if you want to make a workers' movement, you have to go out and talk to the workers. Where's that gone? So I think that's actually what Fisher was pointing at, also with acid communism, very, very strongly. He was suggesting that has to happen, and it would happen through real life interactions. Yeah, all of that was there. So I think if that's a legacy, then we have to try and make that happen, or rather, the legacy of Fisher still could be that. And not just Fisher, of course, but he's a good rallying point because he rightfully is so popular as a theorist. So great. I think that's probably something we can wrap up on. Thanks for being here. So this has been the first Digital Moralia on Sublation Media. Please do go and look at, which I'll bring up now, Sublation Media's. I'm actually going to plug my own text as such, but there it is. But here is the Sublation Media, or Sublation Magazine, and Sublation Magazine is also responsible for publishing a number of books that are coming out shortly. It's a new press of Doug Lane, and they also have a YouTube channel. This is the Twitch we're on now. And if you've just joined us, you can see all of this. I think it's going to stay on the Twitch. It will be uploaded onto the Theory Wave Nights. That's Theory Wave Nights YouTube soon, and possibly other channels. And great. I hope you three will join me again at some point, together and separately. And thank you for being here. Okay.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye.
Bye, everyone.